Welcome to another edition of our treatment of the International Sunday School lesson. Today's lesson is entitled The Faith in Action Preacher, and it's for April the 11th, 2021, Spring Quarter, Lesson number 6. It's taken from Ezra, the 10th chapter, verses 1 through 12. Now, a little background information. Today's lesson is taken from the book of Ezra. And Ezra records the two separate returns from the Babylonian captivity that the children of Israel experienced. They returned the first time in BC 536, and that's covered in the first section of the book of Ezra, from Ezra 1 through 6. And then there was a second wave of return from the exile that took place in 515 BC by the children of Israel. And that's covered in chapters 7 through 10 of the book of Ezra. And if you'll remember back, the children of Israel were commanded to be particularly careful not to take up the paganism of the people surrounding them, the original inhabitants of the Middle East. And the children of Israel did not adhere to that. They intermingled with them. They assumed their paganism and took on their paganistic, idolatrous practices and fell into sin. And that is the reason why God turned them over to the Babylonians and to the Assyrians during those times of punishment. And as we're talking about today, it's real important for us to completely, fully grasp what is being said here. The pagans who were there in the Middle East had taken the children of Israel and had led them astray. It was not a racial thing. It was not even so much a governmental thing that was the problem. It was the fact that the surrounding people were pagans. They worshiped other gods. They did detestable things like sacrificing their children to idols and temple prostitutes. Their practices were despicable. And it was completely contrary to what God had wanted the children of Israel to do, which was to worship Him, to worship the one true God. And every time when you see the children of Israel get involved with these people, they would be led astray. And it's just like nowadays, if you see someone who gets saved, gets in church, and they start hanging out with in bars and hanging out with loose people, the next thing you know, they'll be backslid. Because if you keep going out into those places, if you go in the beer joints and things like that and hang out there, the next thing you know, you're going to be throwing a drunk and conducting yourselves in a manner that you shouldn't be doing. And that's what this is talking about in today's lesson, is hanging out with the wrong crowd and letting them entice you into their sin and following them into idolatry. Ezra 10, verses 1 and 2. While Ezra was praying and confessing, weeping and throwing himself down before the house of God, a large crowd of Israelites, men, women, and children, gathered around him. They too wept bitterly. Then Shechaniah, son of Jehoel, the one of the descendants of Elam, said to Ezra, "We have been unfaithful to our God by marrying foreign women from the peoples around us. But in spite of this, there is still hope for Israel." Now, again, let me restate something. The marrying the foreign women that is referred to here, the problem with that was the foreign women worshiped other gods. It was the fact that they were being enticed and motivated to participate in the idolatry that was going on around them. God had warned them about that all the way back to the point in the time when they were going to go into before they went into the promised land. Exodus 34, 12 through 14. Be careful not to make a treaty with those who live in the land where you are going, or they will be a snare among you. Break down their altars, smash their sacred stones, and cut down their Asherah poles. Do not worship any other god, for the Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. And that's the warning they went into this with. It is also something they did not adhere to, and it was a snare to generation after generation after generation of the Israelite people. You can see even some of the ones who started off well got caught up into that snare. For example, Solomon. It was a snare to King Solomon, who started off so great as his wisdom that God had given him. But he married all of those foreign women who worshiped other gods, and it became a snare to him. The same thing holds true today. Now, I've been a youth pastor. I was a youth pastor twice over the course of my lifetime. And this is something that I said the whole time that I was a youth pastor, and something that I would strongly recommend to young people now. If you are a Christian, seek out another Christian to marry. Do not marry a non-Christian and expect to change them. Okay? Paul was talking to the Corinthians. 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 16. Do not be yoked together with unbelievers. For what do righteousness and wickedness have in common? Or what fellowship can light have with darkness? What harmony is there between Christ and Belial? Or what does a believer have in common with an unbeliever? What agreement is there between the temple of God and idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God has said, I will live with them and walk among them, and will be their God, and they will be my people. It's important for a Christian to, as we join ourselves together in marriage, partners ourselves together in business, it is important for Christians to link together with other Christians. Okay? Okay, Ezra 10, verses 3 and 4. Now, let us make a covenant before our God to send away these women and their children, in accordance with the counsel of my Lord and of those who fear the commands of our God. Let it be done according to the law. Rise up. This matter is in your hands. We will support you, so take courage and do it. Now, the solution at that time, during that time frame, in this situation was that they were going to put away and send packing the adulterous wives where they had went and married to the pagans who lived in the area. Now, in the New Testament, Paul was talking to the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 7:12 through 14. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer, and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer, and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the believing husband has been sanctified with his wife. The unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So we need to take this real serious. Christians should not be jumping up and divorcing. Now, there are some legitimate reasons for divorce. And I'm not going to sit here on the radio or on YouTube and try to give you every single thing that can happen. I don't believe, if somebody's running around on you, and you can't work your way through it, clearly you have a grounds for divorce. I'll also just be real blunt and plain about something. If you are not feeling safe in the marriage that you're in, and you feel like someone is physically threatening you, leave. That's all there are to it. But beyond that, I'm not going to set up and try to give you direction by radio or YouTube in those matters. But I will tell you this, that, and this happens a lot of times, people will, they go out, they live under unchristian rules, they're not saved. A couple, they maybe have multiple marriages behind them, and then they go into the house of God, they get saved. In whatever condition you get saved in, you need to stay in that condition. I mean, I've heard of people trying to, they'll be on like their third marriage, they'll get saved and try to leave the third marriage to go back to the first marriage, thinking they're trying to rectify something. In whatever state you get saved in, you need to consider that's your starting point. Okay? And if you get saved, if one party gets saved and the other person is not a Christian, and the non-Christian is willing to stay married to the Christian, then the Christian should be fine with that and go on and continue on. Under no circumstances should a Christian, someone get saved and the other party is not saved, under no circumstances should the Christian leave the non-Christian because they're not accepting Christ. That is not a legitimate reason to leave a spouse. And that's what Paul is saying here. If the non-Christian is willing to stay in the marriage and they're not running around on you and they're not threatening you or beating you or some kind of thing like that, then you're supposed to stay married. A Christian is not supposed to leave a non-Christian because they're not accepting Christ. Okay? Ezra 10, 5, and 6. So Ezra rose up and put the leading priests and Levites and all Israel under oath to do what had been suggested. And they took the oath. Then Ezra withdrew him from before the house of God and went to the room of Jehoianan, son of Elishab, while he was there. He ate no food and drank no water, because he continued to mourn over the unfaithfulness of the exiles. And I can't read those verses without thinking of that verse in 2 Chronicles. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And it is almost 100% in every history I've ever read of any great revival. There was a seeking the face of God that took place. There was a humbling of the people before the great revival took place. And if we're going to see a revival in this country, we've got to experience that same thing. We have got to humble ourselves before God and seek His face. Ezra 10, 7 and 8. A proclamation was then issued throughout Judah and Jerusalem for all the exiles to assemble in Jerusalem. Anyone who failed to appear within 3 days would forfeit all his property, in accordance with the decision of the officials and elders, and would himself be expelled from the assembly of the exiles. So we see here they had a great meeting where they were all called together. And that is something that as soon as we all get vaccinated, I am looking forward to good convention style singings, good get-togethers. That's something that is critical for our spiritual well-being, is that getting together, that spiritual getting together. Ezra 10, verse 9 and 10. Within the 3 days, all the men of Judah and Benjamin had gathered in Jerusalem. And on the 20th day of the 9th month, all the people were sitting in the square before the house of God, greatly distressed by the occasion and because of the rain. Then Ezra the priest stood up and said to them, "You have been unfaithful. You have married foreign women, adding to Israel's guilt." And I want to really, especially those of us who are called to the ministry, to notice this moment in Ezra's life where he had that moment where he had to get up and say something that was very unpopular. And it is critical when people who are called in the ministry are faced with those moments. It is absolutely critical that you put both feet down, look people straight in the eye, and bluntly tell them what God has sent you to say. And there are times where you will say it, and you'll look out in the congregation, and there will be someone looking back at you with extremely harsh look on their face. You cannot let that stop you. You cannot let that offend you, because that is what you are called to do. To put both feet down, look people straight in the eye, and tell them the truth that God has sent you to tell them. Ezra 10, verses 11 and 12. Now honor the Lord, the God of your ancestors, and do His will. Separate yourselves from the peoples around you and from your foreign wives. The whole assembly responded with a loud voice, "You are right. We must do as you say." So we see here how that Ezra spoke the truth and the people obeyed. Okay? Now, in conclusion, I want to re-emphasize and restate some of today's points. First off, don't get yourself involved and linked up with people who are going to entice you into sin. Don't go out running around with people drinking and cavorting and doing all this other kind of stuff. Don't go out go out with them as they're partying, because before you know it, you're going to be falling into that kind of sin. Okay? Other thing, if you are called in the ministry, do just like Ezra did. There are going to be times God's going to give you a message that is going to be uncomfortable to deliver. Go ahead and deliver what God has for you to say. The other thing, if you are being told one of those messages and you hear a preacher get up and preach a hard message that might even offend you, may hurt your feelings, take it to heart. If it agrees with what's in the Bible, take it to heart. And when we see ourselves and we're convicted of our sins, seek the face of God and repent. Well, friends, good Lord willing, I'll be back with you next weekend.